April 1945, southern Germany. The smell hit us before we even passed through the gate. It wasn't the smell of battle. I knew that smell. Gunpowder, mud, iron. This was something else, something worse, something that didn't have a name until you saw the men it came from. My name is James Walker, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Army, under General George S. Patton. I had followed that man through North Africa, through Sicily, through the hedgerows of France, through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. I had seen Patton angry. I had seen him cold. I had seen him stand over dying men and weep when no one was watching. But on that morning, April 16th, 1945, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. And the order he gave me before the day was over, I carried it out without question. Because there are moments when a soldier doesn't need to understand an order, he just needs to know it's right. This is what happened. 2 days before Patton arrived, our unit had been attached to the 80th Infantry Division when they liberated the camp on April 14th. I was among the first soldiers through the gate. I have tried for years to describe what we found inside. I have never fully succeeded. There were men standing in the yard, Americans, our own, wearing the tatters of uniforms we recognized, U.S. Army issue though barely. They stood or tried to stand like scarecrows assembled from kindling. Their eyes were wide, watching us approach, but their bodies couldn't match the expression. They wanted to run to us. They could barely lift their arms. Private First Class Daniel Cooper from Abilene, Texas, reached out and grabbed my sleeve. He didn't say a word, he just held on. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I had to turn away for a moment to collect myself. This man, who should have been 175, 180 pounds, maybe weighed 85. His cheekbones were trying to exit his face. His fingers around my sleeve were like dry sticks, but his eyes, Lord, his eyes were alive, burning. He was still in there, still fighting after more than 2 years of this. "How long?" I managed to ask. "Since Kasserine," he said. "February 1943. Over 2 years." I helped him to the ground, called for a medic and stood up slowly. Around me dozens of men in the same condition, some worse, some who weren't moving at all. Captain James Morrison, our battalion surgeon, was already moving through them, kneeling, checking pulses, writing furiously in his notebook. His face was professionally controlled. His hands were shaking. I walked to Morrison. "How bad?" He looked up at me. "The average weight for men who should be 170 to 180 pounds is 95 pounds. Some are under 80. He paused. "They didn't starve from neglect, Walker. This was deliberate. 800 calories a day for 2 years. That's half of what a man needs to survive. They were being rationed to death." I didn't respond. I didn't have words for it. Behind the camp, a work detail from the 80th was already moving dirt. They'd found the graves, shallow, unmarked, recent. Americans buried without markers, without names, without anyone telling their families. By sundown of that first day, they'd recovered 47 bodies. Morrison kept writing, I kept walking, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a question was forming. A question every soldier asks when he sees something like this. Where was the man responsible? Oberst Heinrich Müller was found hiding in a farmhouse 5 miles east of the camp on the morning of April 16th. 2 of our MPs brought him in just before 0900. Clean uniform, polished boots, well-fed, healthy. The contrast between him and the men in that yard was not just offensive, it was obscene. He was placed under guard in the camp courtyard, standing at attention. German military discipline, even now, even here, even after everything. He stood straight, he looked forward, he waited. I was standing 20 feet away when Patton's jeep rolled through the gate. I had seen Patton arrive at many places, battlefields, hospitals, command posts. He always moved with purpose, always with energy. That morning, he stepped out of the jeep and went still, completely still. He stood at the gate and looked at the yard, at the men sitting and lying in the pale April sun, at the medics moving carefully among them with measured spoonfuls of broth. He stood there for almost a full minute. Nobody spoke. Then he walked forward. Slow, deliberate, measured steps. He moved among the survivors the way a man moves through a church, not with reverence exactly, but with something like it. He stopped at Daniel Cooper, crouched down, asked his name, his unit, how long he'd been held. Cooper answered, and when Patton stood back up, his jaw was set like concrete. He walked to Sergeant William Hayes from Zanesville, Ohio. Same questions, same answers, less soup than Cooper, he said. The rations had gotten smaller over time. Every month, a little less. Patton listened. He always listened, even though history remembers him for talking. Then he walked to the camp kitchen. I followed at a respectful distance because I sensed this was a moment I needed to witness. He examined the stores, nearly empty, a few sacks of potatoes, some grain. Then he found the records, German efficiency, everything written down, every delivery, every allocation, 800 calories per prisoner per day, documented in clean columns. And then, in a separate ledger, Müller's mess records, breakfast, lunch, dinner for the commandant and his staff, meat, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee. Patton closed that ledger quietly. He set it back on the desk with two hands, gently, like it might break. Then he walked back outside. He stopped in front of Müller. I moved closer. I needed to hear this. Patton looked at Müller the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of cold, focused examination. He spoke quietly. That was the thing about Patton that people misunderstood. The speeches, the helmet, the ivory-handled pistols, that was theatre. The real Patton operated in a register below, shouting, "Your name? Oberst Heinrich Müller, Wehrmacht, serial number. How long were you commandant here?" 2 years, sir. And in those 2 years, how many prisoners died? Müller hesitated. I don't have exact numbers. Patton held up Morrison's report. 47 in the last 3 months alone. We're still counting the rest. He let that sit for a moment. Why? Sir. Why did they die? Müller straightened. The war, sir. Resources were limited. Rations were allocated by higher command. I distributed what I received. You received 800 calories per prisoner per day. Yes, that was the allocation. The Geneva Convention requires 2,000. Germany was under significant strain, sir. The war... How much did you weigh? Patton said, cutting him off, when you took command here. Müller blinked. It was the last question he expected. Perhaps 180 pounds. And now? Müller shifted. He didn't answer. Patton turned to me. Walker. Sir, get a scale from the infirmary. That was the order. Simple. 5 words. I carried it out in under 3 minutes, found a medical scale in the camp infirmary and brought it to the courtyard. Set it in front of Müller. Patton pointed at it. Step on. Müller looked at the scale, looked at Patton, then obeyed. The scale registered 195 pounds. Patton looked at the number, then at Müller, then at the men sitting in the yard behind them, the skeletons, the hollow eyes, the 87-pound Texan holding on to consciousness by sheer stubbornness. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it, but I heard every word. You gained weight, Patton said. While your prisoners starved, you gained weight. The officer rations were a separate allocation. I read your ledger. Patton took one step closer. Meat, vegetables, butter, coffee, every day. While men under your care ate watery soup and moldy bread and died in the dirt and got buried without their names on the ground above them. I followed regulations. I distributed what I was given. I am not responsible for... Patton stepped closer still. When he spoke next, his voice was almost gentle. That was the most frightening thing about it. You are responsible for every man in this camp. You accepted that responsibility when you took command. That is what command means. That is what it has always meant. I followed orders. You watched them die and did nothing. I had no authority to... You didn't starve with them. The words fell like stones. You didn't suffer with them. You didn't even pretend to care. You sat at a desk, ate your meals, kept your records and counted bodies. You are not a soldier. You are a clerk, a bureaucrat in a uniform, and you used regulations as an excuse to let men die. Müller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Patton turned slightly, not to Müller, but as if speaking to the camp itself, to the men in it, to the unmarked graves behind it. When this war is over, he said, and historians write about what happened here, they won't remember your name. They won't care about your orders or your regulations. They'll remember the men who survived despite you, and the men who didn't because of you. He turned back to me. Walker, sir, take him into custody. I want every record in this camp, medical logs, ration books, death counts, meal records for the officer staff, documented and preserved, all of it, for the trial. Müller opened his mouth. I was following... Patton turned back one final time, just for a moment, just long enough. No, he said. You were surviving at their expense. There is a difference. I put my hand on Müller's arm. He didn't resist. The trial came in June 1945. American Military Tribunal, Augsburg. Captain Morrison testified for 4 hours. His medical records were systematic, exhaustive, undeniable. Weight charts, photographs, vitamin deficiency diagnoses, death reports, the testimony of survivors who could now barely stand to give it. I testified. I described what I had seen when we entered the camp. I described Daniel Cooper's hand on my sleeve. I described the scale in the courtyard and the number it showed, and the 95-pound men watching from the yard. The defense argued orders, higher command, limited resources, the fog of a collapsing war. The tribunal asked one question: did you ever request additional rations for the prisoners? Müller said no. Did you ever formally report the deteriorating conditions to higher command and request medical intervention? No. Why not? He had no answer. Not one that mattered. Guilty. War crimes. Negligent homicide. Abuse of prisoners. 20 years. He served 15, released in 1960, returned home to a quiet life in Bavaria. He died in 1973, never having spoken publicly about the camp. Never having expressed remorse, never having said a single word to the families of the 47 men buried in unmarked ground behind the wire. But the survivors remembered. Daniel Cooper went home to Texas weighing 87 pounds. He spent 2 years rebuilding his body. He kept a photograph, taken by an army photographer on April 14, 1945, of himself sitting shirtless in the camp yard, ribs like ladder rungs, eyes like deep wells. He showed it to his children, his grandchildren. He told them the story the way I am telling you now. Müller didn't pull a trigger, Cooper said years later. He didn't beat us. He didn't even raise his voice to us. He just didn't feed us and kept eating himself. And that kind of evil, that quiet paperwork evil, that's the kind that's hardest to see coming. I have thought about that day for the rest of my life. I think about Patton standing in that courtyard, voice quiet, choosing every word with surgical precision. I think about the scale in my hands and what it meant when I set it down in front of that man. I think about what Patton said afterward in a private debrief when he was writing his report. He called it something I have never forgotten. He called it the bureaucracy of cruelty. Men like Müller, he said, don't see themselves as killers. They see themselves as administrators. They are following procedure, maintaining order, processing the paperwork. The deaths are a column in a ledger, not a moral failure. The regulations are a shield, not a responsibility. But the men in the graves don't care about the paperwork. Their families don't care about the regulations. The 87-pound man with his hand on your sleeve doesn't care that someone in Berlin set the allocation. There is always a choice, even inside a system, even under orders, even in a losing war. You can request more. You can report what you see. You can refuse to eat well while the men in your care are dying. You can choose to suffer with them, even a little, even symbolically, as a gesture that you see them as human beings and not as inventory. Müller never made that choice. He made the other one every single day for 2 years, and the scale in that courtyard told the whole story more clearly than any testimony ever could. Daniel Cooper lived until 1987. He was 68 years old. At his funeral, his daughter read something he had written, a short paragraph found in a notebook beside his bed. "I survived Müller's camp because I refused to stop being a person. I don't know how I did it. I don't know where that came from. But I know this. The men who came through the gate for us, men like Sergeant Walker, men like the soldiers of the 80th, they looked at us and saw soldiers, not skeletons. They treated us like men. And that recognition, that moment of being seen, that is what finally convinced my body it was allowed to live. When Patton gave me that order, 'Walker, get a scale,' he wasn't just preparing a confrontation. He was constructing a truth, a visible, undeniable, physical truth that no regulation, no allocation record, no chain of command excuse could explain away. The scale didn't lie, and neither did the men in the yard. There is a stone marker at the site today. On it, carved in granite, are the names of the 47 Americans found in those unmarked graves. And below the names, a single line, Patton's words from that courtyard on April 16, 1945. "You didn't starve with them. You didn't suffer with them. You sat at a desk and counted bodies." I was there when he said it. I've never forgotten it, and I never will. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories of World War II, the moments of justice, of courage, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, subscribe, because history isn't just dates and battles. It's the weight on a scale. It's a hand on a sleeve. It's a quiet voice in a courtyard, choosing truth over comfort. Every time.